There are quite a number of people online, so I'm not able to give you access to your microphone. So if you do have questions, keep them in mind, and there will be time at the end for a bit of Q&A. So this is making the most of architecture roadmaps. My name is Christine Thompson. I work with WebAge Solutions, handling a lot of their architecture initiatives, and you can reach me at the email being provided, christine.thompson@webagesolutions.com. And WebAge, as you may already know, has a wide range of training across a number of topics and has a full library dedicated to supporting working with architecture initiatives with organizations such as the ones that you are from. Furthermore, we also offer TOGAF certified training. Now this particular talk, what we're going to be looking at over this next hour, is about roadmaps that architects would use. Divided this topic into the following areas. The first thing we're going to look at are just the basics, understanding what goes into a roadmap and how to work with them. And then understanding that, we're going to go through discussing a number of different styles and their uses, with the idea that different styles are for different audiences and will support getting better results out of your architecture. So about the architecture governance, being able to measure and monitor, and how do roadmaps tie into that. And then the final unit of the talk is about the challenges. So we'll be looking at issues around what if you're missing information or resources, how does that get reflected, what do you do about it. Also the importance of working with your stakeholders, so knowing your audience, and that roadmaps, as we'll see, are a communication tool. And then of course, over time things change, so the roadmap that you created at the beginning of the work needs to be kept up to date. So when would you do that, and how would you, and some of the issues around working with that. We'll close out the conversation just by highlighting that we do have some training to support working with roadmaps and other architecture work. We'll have that at the very end. So without further ado, let's take a look. So the basics of roadmaps. Now I'm sure everybody in this group knows what a roadmap is. Certainly just even the word itself, this is a map to basically plan where we're going. And you know, if you're in a car, you have your map, but when we're doing any of our work, whether it's a project or architecture or other business things, we talk about what things are we doing in what order. So that's the general concept of it. But there's more to it for architecture. So let's start basically with, where do we begin when we create the architecture roadmap? And the analogy I have here is when you're using GPS or when you're using something like Google Maps, the typical thing is that you put in the destination first, and then you specify where do you want the starting place to be. Will it be your current location, or is it a specific address? So we always start at the end. And this means that I'm not going to create a roadmap without having an understanding of what the to-be state, the desired vision is. I need to have that up front. Tell me where you want to go and I'll tell you how to get there, basically. So with this as well, when we have the target state defined, it's going to contextualize the as is, or the current state. So I need the to be first in order to understand in architecture terms what my starting place would be. And that brings us then to working with the architecture baseline. We need to articulate our current state as it relates to where we want to go. So we're going to limit what is pertinent. One of the anti-patterns working with roadmaps is overdoing the current state, thinking it has to be exhaustive. And even at, no matter what architecture you're doing, you're always going to be thinking that the baseline or the current state for the roadmap, building it off of the baseline, is going to be a subset of everything that you have and everything that's going on. It's what relates to where you're going to go. So obviously this would be done by leveraging a baseline. So I'm thinking if you have an enterprise architecture program, they should be tasking each domain with the work of taking inventory. And obviously the ways in which that inventory is documented and supported and maintained is meant to be easily consumed by various architecture initiatives, whether they're solution architecture work or domain-specific work, that we're easily able to find out what resources existing are going to help us achieve the end result. But a lot of times, if there is a baseline, it might be incomplete. If there's not, then we're looking at having to add in extra time to figure out, well, what resources do we have that are relevant to what we want to build? So extra time and effort has to be added in. So clearly already, just by going through the exercise of trying to figure out what your current state is, which is part of doing a roadmap, you're benefiting, because then you can actually start to understand, well, wait a minute, we don't have a baseline, I have no idea what we have. We're going to have to add in the time and the appropriate budget and skills to be able to complete this work properly. Especially because a lot of organizations recognize the importance of doing reuse. How can I reuse if I don't know what we have and how it works? So then investigating what currently exists, understanding, being able to identify, well, is it actually going to be something that we can use in this new way? And if so, what kinds of changes or what kind of implications is this going to have to the existing system and the dependencies it has, as well as those that are consuming those systems? So understand the implications then of the changes, and that would have to be factored in to identifying it as something to be reused. So we started with the end, having that vision, determining the target state. We then go to our current state, hopefully being able to leverage a baseline. If not, we're filling the gaps. And then we can actually do the analysis of that information, to do the gap analysis to figure out what actually has to happen. So what are we going to reuse? What are the new components we need? What are we going to drop? So this is really the delta between the target and the current states. And what we want to make sure doing this gap analysis is that we haven't missed anything. So here's another activity that is directly related to doing a roadmap, which is ensuring the integrity of our architecture. So even if you never get to doing the actual roadmap, just going through this exercise is actually going to bring value. So it's not only about making sure that we have all the components and systems identified for fulfilling the target, but also understanding the stakeholder concerns around the systems, so that any proposed changes or any requirements are actually being mapped to those components as well. And as was mentioned before, one of the things we want to do is obviously maximize reuse. This can save time and money, improving the return on our investment. But don't forget to factor in any of those implications. When you start using something in an additional or different way, there may be other things that you have to explore, which would then lead you that when you get to this gap analysis phase, you want to make sure that you're involving the appropriate experts to give you opinions about your choices, right? So as an architect, I need to understand for the various components who's the go-to person that can talk to me about it with respect to using it for my new system that I'm building. And this is a tool that you could use to support doing the gap analysis matrix. I'm just wondering in the group how many of you have actually worked with this kind of technique. Just raise your hand if you have. Where in analyzing basically at the beginning what you're going to need, that you've actually put it in some tabular format to basically fill in the blanks to make sure that you have everything to track it. Let me just raise your hand. We've got a few of you saying that you have. It's such an easy thing to do, and it does actually very quickly visually render good results. You can see across the top, we're identifying for my target, I have these different systems that I actually need. So this is us understanding the vision, right? Articulating, basically decomposing it at it doesn't have to be at a very granular level, but at least at a component level as it relates to the architecture. And then using that information, I start looking at what we currently have, identifying what is connected to this target. And you can see in here that one of the things that in building this target, I'm also identifying, well, this target actually replaces some things we currently have. So in this example here, the broadcast services is going to be eliminated. We're basically saying this isn't working for us anymore. We're going to get a brand new system. We're architecting it, and it's going to be made up of this video, telephony, and mailing services. So we're going to drop this guy. And then we start going through, well, what do we currently have that relates? So you can see that we already have video conferencing services, and that actually is something we want to exploit better. We do have a telephony service, so we've got a question mark here, and this is where we would need to start gathering in technical experts to help us see the fit. Could we reuse it, and if so, what changes would be needed? And so you could be articulating that in the cell, a little bit of that information. And then an additional thing that was identified in the current state is basically saying it's not part of this target architecture, so it's not going to be used in this way. And then, of course, don't forget that part of the gap analysis is to identify anything that's new. So it's not part of our current, but basically in order to fulfill some key components, we've actually identified this is what we need to add, right? So something that we might be building, might be buying. So that decision comes after that gap analysis. So again, this will lead into that conversation with determining the best approach. Right? So wonderful technique, and then this gives us a traceable architecture. So it's the beginning of being able to say, this is why we have these components here, this is why that's changing, this is why that's dropping. And again, this is just one of the steps that we use in order to build our roadmaps. Now that we have all the components identified, we now have to plan it out. So organizing them in a way of being able to group tasks together so they become what we're calling work packages. And then we have to take those work packages and determine the order in which they should be executed. And when we're working on the order, we're going to be thinking of a few things. Now, an obvious one is basically if there's a dependency, whatever's the base has to be there before something that's going to use it is there, right? So we're often focusing in that way, but we want to also highlight to not miss the opportunities to bring the value back to the business. Architecture is meant to do IT business alignment, and we should always be thinking about the fact that anything that we do in architecture should always be about being able to express it in terms of value that is meaningful to the organization. So identify where the early wins are. Ideally, you're able to build momentum such that it can start feeding the funding of the architecture work. The savings that you make or revenue that gets generated because certain components are now in place helps with building that momentum and supporting the funding. And obviously, by having those things there, it's going to improve the buy-in. So immediately they can see that they're going to have results. And furthermore, as you continue to do the work, because arguably a lot of architecture that we want to do is going to happen over time. It's not like a one-week thing. So we want to make sure that the buy-in that we get is sustainable. And another thing that we're going to be looking at is factors of readiness. Now, arguably, when we went and did that gap analysis and we're looking at what do we currently have, again, we get focused on the systems and components, but we need to remember the human skills as well as one of the aspects that have to be factored in. So what is the readiness? If we're doing reuse, how close is it? If we have to do something new, what are the resources, technically speaking, to fit it? But then also, what are the skill sets? Not only the skill sets, but the availability of those human resources. So this one is a big question mark, right? And we have to make sure that we plan for that. If it's going to take time to ramp up certain skills, we might say, well, let's get these pieces taken care of while others are getting training, and then we'll do those new pieces with the new technology a little bit later down the road, right? So that we don't lose any time again trying to keep the momentum going. And then, of course, when we're thinking of our prioritization and organizing it, we're also going to think about having, along the way, stable states in the architecture. So make sure you plan for transitions. Now, a transition architecture is meant to give you the opportunity to reevaluate what's going on and where you're at. And historically, when we first started doing transition architectures, we had them as maybe like way off, like a year down the road, we'll stop and take a look and we should have these pieces in there. But more and more, we're looking to have those transition architectures happen more frequently. It's just a reflection of the changing in technology, the changing in business, the volatility of marketplaces, and that what we can't have is something that's in a state of flux that's not stable that we can't use. So we always want to think about getting quickly to a place where we can catch our breath, if you will, reassess, and make sure that we still want to go in this particular direction. And that if we need to stop, how many of you are from the United States? Raise your hand if you're in the United States. Okay, we've got, yeah, see, we've all, I'm actually in Canada speaking to you. Thank you for raising your hand there. And you, obviously, Americans have been sort of the focal point, but there's a very good example with your election. All the time and energy, a lot of businesses are going, okay, we need to just sort of wait, see what's going to happen, and we want to make sure that we're not in a position where if certain changes happen from the government that we're going to be in a bad position to be able to respond. So with a new government coming in, we want to make sure that we're basically in a more quiet spot, like a transition architecture. So we use those strategically in order to ensure that we're getting good value to the business, but ensuring stability as things, conditions change. All right, so we take that information, and then we have to start expressing all of the information we've gathered. We've got the vision and the target state. We've got the current state played off of the baseline. We did our gap analysis. We prioritized it. And now we actually want to communicate our findings out. This is where the actual roadmap comes in. So these are meant to support our architecture work. And clearly, probably what I've seen in most organizations is you have a very good roadmap that architects and technical leads can use. And maybe you might have one that's a slightly higher level for the broader audience. But we need to maybe look at these in a little bit more flexible way, that these could be things that we could craft quickly. Once you've done that initial work of the vision, the current state, and the gap analysis, the roadmap itself could be done repeatedly in order to support different work that you're doing with various stakeholder groups. Also, when other issues come up, you can actually go back through and use different roadmaps in order to help you identify any issues, being able to manage certain changes, being able to plan out resources, timing, and budgets. So it can be a technique that you actually work with on an ongoing basis, not something that's done just once at the beginning, but something that you can draw on repeatedly as you continue to work with completing the architecture. So a good approach for doing this would be to apply the views and viewpoints approach. Raise your hand if you're familiar with that terminology, views and viewpoints. I'm giving you exercise today. Okay, so I've got about half of you raising your hand. So views and viewpoints, there's actually a standard out there for this, and the idea is that viewpoints is the term we're using to describe the metadata about any documents that we create, diagrams that we create. It would include the stakeholder that this is for, the concerns that they would have. So when you're in a situation, you say, well, I've got to go to the executives and present them information about my architecture, and they're very concerned about the security. That kind of information would be captured in the viewpoint. And then in that situation, what kind of things would you have at the ready? Again, that would be in the viewpoint. And then using that information, that's like the instructions, I can then draw up maybe a graph, I can have a diagram, a reference model, and I take those things to the executives, and based on their response, I can put in the viewpoints, these are templates that I work with and I had great success, or don't forget to include this piece of information. So views and viewpoints is something that you probably want to learn, not just for roadmaps, but for any kind of architecture work. The emphasis is you're thinking about the stakeholders and their concerns. So you always want to think about the audience in mind. So the same thing is true of roadmaps. Who is going to be using this roadmap and for what purpose? What kind of questions do they have? Now the roadmap could be just for the architecture team, right? So you create it then, well, what kind of questions and concerns do architects have about what I'm doing? But then there's also all the other stakeholders that are impacted, that will be implementing, that will be supporting, and they're going to have each their own perspective. So use this approach. And obviously the types we're going to go through, not all types are required. It's going to be done on a case-by-case basis, but there are a few that you're going to commonly see. So this leads in nicely to the next section. Let's start looking at, well, what are the different types of roadmaps that I would use, and when do I actually use them? And how can I get more out of them? So this section, we're going to look at the roadmap options. So the first steps, after doing the gap analysis, I've got all the components, and I'm going through how do I order these. Now, in this example, it's showing grouping it based on people, technology, and maybe different areas of concern. So however you want to logically start grouping it, it should be that in your architecture work, you should be able to start thinking in terms of streams of work. Streams should be relatively, not completely, independent of other streams. But obviously, you need all of these working together to complete the whole picture of your architecture. Notice the other thing, when I'm working with laying out these components, I'm not looking at any dates. I'm just trying to figure out the priorities. What should happen first? So starting to play around with that positioning. And if you recall from a few slides back, we were thinking about the dependencies. That's the first one. So obviously, if I was in here, define the SLA comes before I can roll out the other components in here. So I have basically an understanding of that dependency. But another thing that I was mentioning was the idea of value to the business, so trying to find the early wins. So what could I focus on first that would give really good momentum to the architecture work? So that should be done early on, and maybe this migration plan is in there. Another thing that we should be thinking of as we start laying out the components, and you don't see it in this particular example, but maybe when I see this piece of work done, I might start thinking, well, while these other things are happening, are we in a stable state? So I want to maybe mark that where we might start thinking about the transition architecture. Now, in this one, this can actually be whiteboarded. This would often be done with the technical leads. You could even have significant business representatives involved in this, just to make sure that the way in which we actually roll this out, that we've got it. So remember, the gap analysis is confirming that we've identified all the pieces required to build the target. This particular roadmap is really trying to figure out what are we going to do first, and what are the implications of it, and the benefits. So play around with these like little blocks, right? So often you would see this done as a whiteboarding activity. Oops, sorry. After we've figured out the order in which things are going to happen, we actually then want to get the buy-in, all right? So does everybody agree? Do we have the green light to build this? Are we going to go ahead? So we'll have this particular style roadmap has two purposes. One is actually, now that we've done the gap analysis and we know what the time looks like, how much this is going to cost, what kind of resources, technical and human skills that we're going to need, we're going to go back to make sure that they understand exactly what is going to happen, how long it's going to take, and how much they have to pay for it. This roadmap, you'll notice a couple of characteristics with it. It's very focused on what can be expected, so the experiences. Right? So these really often are going to be highlighting what you've identified as the transition architecture states. So by the time we get A, B, and C done, we should be seeing these results. And it should be, and here we've got like actual time, so 6 months, 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3 years. This is obviously indicating the idea that from when we start, like once you give us the green light, expect in 6 months to see these results. And then a year or two later, expect to see these results, right? So it's very experientially based with loose timelines associated with it. So getting the buy-in then from the stakeholders, you can have a slight refinement of this style of roadmap in order to get the larger community aware of what we're doing. Now, another thing that happens with this style of roadmap is the question as to why are we doing this is answered. So your rationale is there. The value to the business is there in this roadmap. So a lot of times, like when people, people face with change, even if the change is good, people are going to resist it, right? So you've had to deal with that pushback that you get from the various stakeholders resisting things that are going on. What is true is that even if people don't agree with you, if they know your rationale, they're going to be more compliant. So this can be an effective tool used up front. So they can go, okay, so I understand why you're doing this, or I understand why you're doing this in this order. Okay, I see that rationale. You can get, now ideally you should be able to communicate very early in these terms, and you can get some, obviously the loudest feedback is going to be the negative feedback, but that might actually be good, right? So getting negative feedback makes you aware of other concerns that you want to pay attention to. And if you already know the answer to those, then maybe have a way to express how those are being addressed. So depending on the voices and how big and loud they are, using expected results roadmap style can really help bring people over into a position of participating in a positive way. Okay, so the first use of this was for the key high-level stakeholders. The second use is for the general large audience where everybody can get onto the same page and hopefully get excited about what it is that you're doing. The next one here, talking about, oh, I see a question just popped up. Let me come back here. Asking me to maximize the view. I will try. I've had issues with it before, but let me try this. Can you raise your hand if you can see this okay, if this is streaming through all right? Raise your hand if you can see this all right. Okay, so thank you very much for that. And let me just go back here so you can, whoops, see a little bit more on this slide since it was minimized. So you can see in this one for the expected results, just to reiterate, you can see we give it a title: rationalize, stabilize, optimize, and we're giving key features that we're looking for as an expression of that in this particular architecture initiative. Other details you can see you can add in just so people have an idea of the scope and the affected systems, but it shouldn't be heavy on the details of the technical aspects and more about the value it's bringing to the business and the experience that the stakeholders should expect to observe. Oops. One too far. So this one, which is the next one, is providing the big picture. And this is now, we've got the green light to go ahead. And what I want to do is start working with the leads. So those that will be implementing aspects of the architecture, I want them to see what they're doing and how it relates to others. And a little bit more of the timing. So this is still big picture, but it's about getting them to recognize who the other players are. And most of the audience for something like this would be those that would be implementing the architecture. And perhaps some of those that might be doing some ongoing support for it. It's really about trying to get the building of the architecture happening. And notice how we've got it organized into groups, so element A, element B, element C, D, right? You see all of that there. And notice that within each of these streams we're seeing the various components they're going to work on. We can see the timing of it. We can see the relationship. So you might even talk about having it linked. And there might be a little bit more detail about certain characteristics, particularly if we don't see it in this one, but if we were to say that something element A was providing element B, that we could show a link that when we get to this point in element A, you can start this. Notice how we see this timing. Why is this delayed here? So it's implied by its delayed start that something else on here had to happen. And that's the kind of conversation you want to evoke by showing a roadmap like this. Is having them say, this is what you're being assigned to build, but understand that while you're doing that, these people are waiting for certain pieces. And what you build is actually going to feed into something else. So this is really about coordinating the teams. I have another question here. Would you bring the same group of stakeholders to review each of these views? I would say that these would be different stakeholders. So when I go back here, this would first be used, or a particular version of this would be used for the high power stakeholders to sign off on, yes, we're going ahead with this, and here's the money, and you've got the green light. I'd then use a variation of this view or roadmap to actually communicate to all stakeholders. But when I get to this one, this is really only for those stakeholders that are actually going to be implementing it. This is going to be more detail specific, kind of making the assignments, if you will, so that everybody knows that they're building something and that they have a relationship with each other, and that there are dependencies that are expected to be fulfilled across groups, so we know about the communication efforts. So this one definitely wouldn't be for the general audience, or I'd worry for the larger stakeholders. Another question, do you go with more senior people for the first high level and then go down? Yeah, absolutely. So this one is for the leads. So the team leads. So depending on the type of architecture, if I was doing solution architecture, then I would be talking about this is what has to happen in business, application, data, and infrastructure domains. So I would be asking for the representatives from each of those domains to be at the table. There might be an additional fourth or fifth, depending on the nature. Maybe we have a security specialist there, or maybe we have a mobile specialist, depending on what we're building in that solution. If this is at a domain level work, regardless of the domain, then I'm expecting the appropriate technical experts that would be heading up the teams. So if this is in applications, then I'm thinking of the application designer and maybe the lead developer would be there. And obviously, depending on the different technologies, having a representative from each technology group at the table so that they can get their assignment. So this is really about managing the assignment of that work to teams, and I'm just working with the team leaders. Does that answer your question? And now when I get down to this one and the next one, well, this one is actually now leading into more of a focus from an architecture perspective. I'm starting to think more about integration points. I'm having a heavier focus on making sure that we're keeping things like working with the schedule. So if I went from that first big picture with the team leads, I'm going to be asking them to do their analysis, so interpreting the architecture to doing the design work, to allow me to flesh out more specifics in the roadmap. Now they're going to be contributing the information to make this roadmap happen. They may actually build their own portion of this roadmap, and then I put the pieces together as the architect coordinating this work. So this allows me a lot more granular level detail on this. And again, my focus as an architect is really thinking about how and when things are going to be integrated. So notice when I start here, what is it that I'm feeding into these streams, and what's happening within each stream, and what's going on first, and what's going to mark the completion of it. Now, we have those that are building the particular components need to know what the architecture requirements are, so that at an exit point we can actually be, notice here, functional specifications complete, we can actually have a certain level of testing. And that we can also be, when we say functional specifications complete, well, are they done in a way that's actually going to fulfill the non-functional, right? Or that's going to work well with the non-functional implications. So we can have those kinds of entry and exit details and look at the lower level pieces that go into it. So if you think of this one stream that I'm highlighting as a system, these are the components, and we can see the relationship that they have. And then there should also be some, in the roadmap itself, I'm not looking to have it overly wordy. I've worked in organizations where what they do is they create, like what I've got highlighted here could actually be a hyperlink to a document, to the test results, to the specifications. So this can actually be the view to navigate a number of other architecture artifacts. And again, this is going to be definitely of interest to those that are coordinating their work with the architect, but for the architect to be able to manage all of these different projects. Arguably, you could say that each of these smaller boxes are individual projects. So the architect's product, the portfolio that they're overseeing, is made up of all of these projects. And then you could have, even at a lower level, a very similar style roadmap that would be not for the necessarily the architect as an audience, but those that are actually like the developers writing the code to see, well, you're writing that component, I'm writing this component, and having them connect together. So we could be zooming in and zooming out using this. But again, this is really about looking at making sure we're on time, we're on budget, and we understand the criteria of entry and exit points. And then next one here, this is really getting down more to the project level. So if I were to go back and look at just this one box here, or perhaps this one system, so it could be box or system, and then I would come to this one where I'm laying out all the lower level bits and pieces. Now as an architect, I'm going to be supporting projects, but we have a project, you have your project manager, you have the different people that are involved. As an architect, I'm going to be keeping track of a number of related projects. I'll be interested to see, well, where are you at, and are there any bottlenecks, and have you factored in the architectural requirements, and are you feeding in? So I'll be interested in this, but this would be done more on the project team itself. Now, again, I will be using this information to keep things like this kind of roadmap up to date. So this one and this one are really about managing all the details and catching early enough on if, oh my goodness, we don't have enough time for this, or we don't have the resources, we're running out of money, that kind of thing, that I want to make sure that I'm, it sounds a lot like project management work, but arguably an aspect of doing architecture involves that. I'm leaning on my project managers to help provide me the information and to make sure that we can push these through. And if we start to see maybe a red flag, that I can then mitigate that concern and go back and see, well, do we have to change something? Do we get more money? Do we allocate more human resources to this? Like, what's actually needed? So by using this as the overseeing document, which is compiled underneath the covers when we zoom in with the project level details, that I can then do proper management to say, yeah, we're on track, or no, we're going to change this, drop that, add this in. And then when you get into the day by day, yeah, the Kanban style, how many of you actually use this style roadmap? Raise your hand. Well, I just see just a couple of you. Okay, so Kanban is Japanese for billboard, and this is really meant to be, and we see this used a lot by Agile teams, very useful tool to be able to keep track of a lot of things, but definitely anybody could use this particular style. So me personally as an architect, I could have my own Kanban going, and when I'm trying to drive particular work, I can go forward with this. So this is about this week, this day in this week, this is what we're doing. And again, this one can be whiteboarded and can be used by anybody. You can see that we have Kanban used for development, but not road mapping. Yeah, now what you can do as an architect in terms of the road mapping is saying for this week, this is what I want to have happen when. Right, so we can start laying out the columns and say, like, this is what, Monday morning I basically am assigning these tasks, and we've got like a short-lived roadmap, and you sort of fulfill what we've laid out here. But clearly, as I would only do that if I have sort of in the finish line and I've got a lot of things to keep track of, where I create, and to me it's like a mini roadmap, because it's not something over a year or over a couple of years, even over months. This is really about today in this week, right? So the longest I would, now you could argue this, but the longest I would use a Kanban would be a 1 week thing. Every week I'd get a new one, because things like the to-dos change, the pending changes, the resolved. But definitely as a management tool, it's very useful, but it's also arguably a style of roadmap, because you're deciding what are you doing when, and that's what roadmaps are all about. Now, we've gone from the big picture, the sales picture, experientially based. Actually, we started with just the components and no dates just to get priorities. And then we were able to articulate the experience and get the buy-in and get everybody on board and excited about this. And then we did the big picture to organize the teams in the work that they were going to do. And then we got down to the level where we're looking at more details, relationships, entry points, exit points, and thinking of integration, keeping things on track. And then the last two were more at the project level, certainly more zoomed in, focused, lower level things. And obviously when you have that work going on, you hit a transition point. When you hit a transition point, you should be stopping to recheck your original plan to see, is it working? Are we getting the results? So in this one, tie it back to the expected results. So if you can see, I've got, perhaps this is like the big picture roadmap, and I'm going to be looking at discrete points. Now arguably, if I see these things finishing, we could say we're here right now, but when I'm here, I really want to stop and do a health check. And notice that we've mapped the roadmap to a maturity model. So the maturity model is a way that I can diagnose the architecture. I can diagnose, are we actually going to be able to continue the work and get good results? Maturity models are basically saying that before I can achieve the level 2 maturity, I have to have passed level 0 and level 1 completely. In other words, if I see any gaps in the lower level, I may be able to start level 2, but I'm really not going to get the results I need. So when I'm at a transition point, I should have an expression of that in terms of expected results. And again, that ties back to that earlier roadmap we mentioned that we use for stakeholder buy-in. But this one is very specifically associated with those transition architectures. and to do that diagnosis of the architecture. And this will also invite me then to make adjustments to the roadmap. Right? So has something happened? Now this goes back to my comment, those of you that are in the States, you've just got a new president, and obviously this is going to have changes coming about, and how will that impact your industry? So any work that you have going on, I would assume, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you're not going to be doing any radical changes, or certainly changes where you know there's issues about compliance or issues about the global market until you start to see the dust settle and you know what you're dealing with, right? So we can continue with certain types of work, but any radical changes we kind of stop. So we sort of sit here and evaluate. Now if I notice that I have any gaps, so if I go back here and I'm at a transition, I'm going, I really should be pretty much through level 1, and I go back, well wait a minute, we're missing or we're weak on this area. I may be adding in another activity to resolve that. So this is the measuring, monitoring piece. Even before the architecture is complete, I have some of it there, and I want to evaluate it. Now some of it's easy to evaluate, you have technical metrics. Some of it's more difficult because it's based on the value back to the business, which may be compiled from different statistics from the use of the architecture. Some of it will be more experientially. Are you finding that you're able to do ABC kind of things? So you can see here business reacting to mobile demand. How are you measuring that? Anything I put in here has got to be able to have a way to be identified down here. So this is me tying it back. All right, so those are the different styles that I selected. Obviously, if you go out there and look, you'll see that there's a lot more, but I tried to gather styles that kind of walked you through the different phases of doing architecture work, and to have you start thinking about, as I go through the different stages, I'm going to be using a different perspective on my architecture. I'm going to be working with different stakeholders who have different concerns, and again, make sure the information you put into any one of those is appropriate for the stakeholders that you're communicating with. Now, as a general thing, we're going to be looking at some of the challenges now that we have when we're doing our roadmaps. Missing or broken pieces. So, is the vision clear? Do you know what the vision is? I've definitely had asked that question to architecture teams. So what's the vision? Where is it? How is it articulated? And I get a lot of blank stares. It's like, I don't know. And to me, that is actually a missing piece. Obviously, it's from the vision that you can then articulate the target. The vision is not the target. The vision is describing the value, the experience that we're going to have at the end of it. The target is going to be a little bit more technical of what it is that needs to be in place to support that vision, right? And then another one is, do you have baseline? And again, in a lot of organizations, it's kind of a hit and miss. Being able to find out what is available may be quick in some areas and then really problematic in others. The different stakeholders that need to provide that information, are they on board, or are they resisting? Are they making it difficult to actually find that out? So again, having good baseline management is going to be instrumental for any architecture initiative at any level in order to very quickly move from a vision into saying, okay, so now I understand what we need and I can talk about the timing and schedule. I mean, how many of you as architects have been frustrated where you're having conversation with the business where they're going, okay, this is what we want, how long is that going to take, or how much money is that going to cost? And they're asking that within the same conversation. And then what you want is to say, okay, I've got your request, give me a day and I'll get back to you, but in reality, is it only going to take a day? Well, if you have a clear vision and you have a baseline, then within a couple of days you should be able to get back to them with an estimate, right? So this would be another area, so maybe it's not missing, but maybe it's incomplete. And then when you do find components that relate, are they actually a good fit? And do you have the resources? Certainly, we're not expected to be experts on everything. Do we have access to those that do have that level of expertise to help us determine the appropriateness of reuse? And then, of course, what would be the cost? It's a bit of a misnomer to think that if I reuse something that's existing, then it's free. There's an impact to it when you're adding more use onto something. So an existing component has a current use, and now we want it to carry the load of something else. So what's the cost? Even if it doesn't itself have to change, maybe it's the support under it has to change. And then, of course, how are we actually getting everybody that's related to that component to understand this new use of it? So these are things that come up if you're struggling with doing roadmaps. Basically, the roadmaps are meant to be tools that make things go faster. If you're finding that, oh, I want to avoid the roadmap, I'm going to get it done and put it away, it might be because it's not the roadmap that's the problem. It's because you're missing key parts in your architecture that are needed in order to validate that it's good. Another one, as you've seen already, is that one size does not fit all. One of the things that I've also seen in organizations is this idea that you've got this checklist of documents or artifacts that you've got to create in order to say your architecture is complete, and one of them is the roadmap. So you go ahead and create the roadmap. You basically have probably more that detailed one that's the entry-exit point where you can actually see the strict times and all the different components, and you've got it all out there. You spend a lot of time building it, and it's done once and put in the folder, and it's basically not used beyond that. Maybe at the beginning, but is it continuing to be used, and is it continually current? And that level of detail is meant for a specific audience at a specific point in the architecture work. So the question is, are you using the right type for the situation that you're in? So who are the stakeholders? What are their concerns? Goes back to views and viewpoints. And then have the appropriate roadmap available for them, or create it. Again, these should be done fairly quickly because the actual information to build them should be at the ready. Now, I mentioned as well that roadmaps, in addition to being tools for working with stakeholders, are also tools for managing your architecture. I highlighted a little bit of how we can use them to diagnose our architecture to make sure it's fine to be able to deal with measuring it, like what are the entry-exit criteria, and being able to do that evaluation. So we use them as management tools. So what are the issues needing attention? We should be able to have that expressed. Remember when I was doing that reality check, I'm measuring against the expected results, and if I don't see them, then I'm going to stop and fix that before we continue on. And then, of course, that does mean that roadmaps are asking for ways in which to measure that you're at a certain point. If I put a transition architecture in place, I'm actually labeling when we're here, we expect to see A, B, and C. And this is what A, B, and C will look like. This is what A, B, C will do, right? So we have the experience there and the way to measure it. So it's enforcing the ability then to measure it. So we've got, going back to gap analysis, traceability, we've got testability built into it, and we've got measurability. So not just one roadmap, but the appropriate roadmap for the kind of information you're looking for. Now, another challenge we face is that things do change over time. And I've got this nice little analogy here, the road trip analogy. I thought it was appropriate given we're talking about road maps. So if you're on a road trip, you can have traffic accidents. If you're doing architecture, there can be issues with your vendor, security breaches, power outages, network failures. If you're on a road trip, it may be construction. Oh my goodness, there's so much construction in this city that I'm in right now. It didn't matter what road I went down. It's like construction after construction. So this is basically what happens as you're going along, and there's a reallocation of staff or components that you need that are now interfering with your schedule and budget. What about the weather? organizational changes such as downsizing, mergers, new strategies, or basically the community at large, economic or political conditions like the election that just happened. There can be different economic, there can be different major events. It could be you have vehicle problems. This is like a component that you're relying on is failing, or a system's not available or ready when it's supposed to be. All of these things happen. So as we're building and we have certain pieces that we've released for use, right, over time, we want to have the value being returned to the business. So it's partly being used but still being built. We can have all of these events happening. So we need to be able to capture this and react to these. And remember that part of architecture is meant, like it should be by nature, quick to respond. It should be bringing about, and I want to use the word agile, but I'm afraid to because of the connotations with software development, but I just mean nimble, right? That we should be watching for these kinds of things and being able to react. So what do we do? One of the things is to have regular stops and checks to confirm the vision is still appropriate, and typically this is associated with transition points or any major event. So maybe we're not at a transition architecture yet, but maybe a major event happened. Well, I'm going to use those major events as, well, let's quickly get to a place where we can stop still and check to see, do we still want to continue down this road, right? It could be that there was some technology revolution that basically says what we're trying to build is no longer even makes sense. We got a new option, right? So we want to reevaluate the expected outcomes against the event that triggered this, whether it's just being at a transition or whether it was a major event. The other thing that we want to do here is looking at the timeline and budget. So we want to verify the commitment to the schedule. Do we still need to have it done in this time, or are we looking to accelerate it, or do we have more time? And then based on both the confirmation of what the vision is and the confirmation of the schedule, we can then determine what the actual costs are. So can we stay on track, or are we changing things? And then that would feed into being able to articulate that we're going to have an update to the roadmap. So we're going to adjust the roadmap to fit the new information. And it could be simply that nothing's changed and we're reconfirming it, that we're in a good state. Look, we have achieved these results. Everything's looking good. Let's go on to the next phase. But if indeed there needs to be adjustment, we want to communicate that out. Lacking to update the roadmap causes stakeholders, architects included, to lose confidence in the roadmap and stop using it, which means we don't benefit from the management and coordination that it provides. Obviously, once we've adjusted it, we need to get the appropriate support to validate it, get it signed off, and then communicate it out. By the way, another thing to caution you about, while I do want to have regular checks and updates to the roadmap, I don't want to overdo it. If you're constantly changing it, then again, you've got the opposite end of it, where I'm thinking that, well, you keep changing your mind, so I'm not going to do anything, where it paralyzes people, or I'll just do my own thing, right? So we want to, there's a sweet spot, right? So no changes, too many changes, both of those don't work. I want sufficient regular checks that make sense in event or transition architecture, where we can reconfirm or adjust what we're actually going to do. So that's the discussion. I wanted to highlight for you that if you're really interested in doing more with roadmaps, we do have a course, Reference Architectures and Roadmaps training, that's just dedicated to doing this. In addition, we do touch on a number of these other topics in our other architecture courses that you can take a look at on our site. So feel free to check out these links, and if you have any questions about it, contact WebAge and we can help you with it. So in summary, we have roadmaps are used to communicate, and they're meant to support doing the management of the architecture work. And use the appropriate style for the situation that you're in. And remember that roadmaps are meant to be adjusted, just like if you were using your GPS and you had to take a change in the road, it reroutes, right? Want to do the same thing. Now I'm noticing here that we've got some comments. Will this presentation be available on the WebAge site? Absolutely. I have been recording it, and we'll make sure that that's there. And you should have also received basically a PDF copy of the slides as well. So I'm just going to stop the recording now, but I'm going to stay online. So if you have any other questions, this ends the presentation. Let me just go to the end. You can see my email address there if you want to communicate with me directly, and also the other contacts for WebAge Solutions. So if you want to make sure you get access to the recording, just go to the WebAge site. And I've also added in there just a couple of articles if you want to read a little bit more about working with roadmaps. So if there aren't any questions, that ends the presentation. I see a question coming up here. How would you manage cost constraints when developing your roadmap? Yeah, so to me, the cost of doing roadmap, this fits into basically the aspect of architecture work where you're doing your scheduling and budget. So it should be a very, very small piece of the work. If it's taking a lot of time, it's not the roadmap that's the problem. It's the fact that your architecture environment is not complete. It's one of those missing pieces. Clearly, if you don't have a baseline, then that has to actually be factored in, that you're going to have to add in, it could be weeks, could be months of doing investigative work. So it becomes this part of your roadmap that says step one is investigation in order to complete the roadmap, right? So really, ideally, doing a roadmap should be very quick, should be very easy. And if it isn't, where's the information? Did that answer your question? I see another question. What do you think is the best up-in class to help helps developing and presenting strategies, of which roadmaps are a component? Developing and presenting strategies. Oh, okay, so focusing on doing strategies. I'm just going to mark down your name. I think we can do a follow-up because there's a few options. So I will get follow-up for you on that. Okay, so are there any other questions? Okay, I'm just rereading this. My question was more around sequencing solution options for the roadmap and managing the cost constraints. Oh yeah, okay. So when you're doing that prioritization phase of trying to figure out what's going to come first, right? So when you have, this is why, like I'm saying, when we, after gap analysis, arguably we could be, we're obviously doing, in gap analysis, you will be engaging the appropriate experts to gather some of that information. But when you go to that next phase where you're laying the pieces out, this is about what and when, right? You're going to have the appropriate experts at the table there, and they should have the information there about, okay, if we're going to use this piece, it's going to take me this much time, and it's going to, these are the kinds of resources. So then that's very early on, like even before we do the stakeholder buy-in, when we're just prioritizing the work. And again, I'm going to be leaning on the owners or stewards of the components of interest to be able to give me at least ballpark in terms of the time and cost associated with the work that we're asking for. And then that actually would allow me in that again, in that high level, I showed you how we're dividing it up into lanes. And remember I said that from a roadmap I could be linking other documents. So I would have as that basically the supporting document for each of those components. And the reason we chose, for instance, if I laid it out and we agreed that this is the order in which it has to happen and this is how much time is needed. So you'll see what and when. The cost can be a supplemental document. It wouldn't actually, I don't like normally when I'm dealing with the money, I want to see that more in a spreadsheet where we can add things up. So I would be linking to an artifact like that, not putting it into the roadmap. Does that answer your question? Would it be sensible to ask the business stakeholder for investment limits to implement solution options? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, you need, that would be part, for me, that's part of the information that's talking about the target. So you have the vision, this is what they want. And when we start talking about the target, even before we get into specifying the details of the component, it would be like, I need to kind of know, give me a time frame and a budget, because that's going to change the target radically. If they have a lot more money, there's a lot more I can do. If we have more time and money, there's a lot more we can do. So absolutely, I want to see those limits up front as an expression of the target. Remember, we do the target first, then we do the current state, then we do the gap analysis, then we prioritize. Yeah. So that should be well understood by them. It would be like going into a car dealership and saying, I want a car. What are they going to show you? If you say, well, I want a car that costs under X amount that can do this, then they can show you the appropriate selection. Otherwise, it's just a free-for-all, and you'd be wasting a lot of time. Yeah. Very good. And, okay. Any other questions? Yeah, you're more than welcome. Thank you very much. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to end the webinar. Again, the email that you received, the notice for the webinar, should give you a link for downloading the presentations. You can also just contact WebH and make sure that you get access to the recording if you want. And hope to see you in a class or on another webinar. Have a good day.